How 9/11 cost the world trillions. The 9/11 Commission's own inquiry determined that the people who conceived and executed the September 11th attacks spent somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000 to pull it off. 19 men, 4 commercial planes, a few months of flight lessons and logistical groundwork. That was the complete operational budget behind the most lethal terrorist attack ever carried out on American soil. What it ultimately cost the country on the receiving end of those attacks is a figure so astronomically larger that the gap between the two numbers is itself a central part of the story. Before a single dollar amount enters the picture, something needs to be said clearly about what this is and what it isn't. This is not an examination of who did this or the forces that drove them to it. That history has been thoroughly documented in other places. This is an exercise in arithmetic, a look at what unfolds financially, economically, and across decades when a country absorbs a blow of this magnitude. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives that morning, at the World Trade Center, at the Pentagon, and aboard 4 aircraft, among them the passengers and crew who chose to fight back over a field outside Shanksville, Pennsylvania. That death toll is not a variable to be studied here. It is the reason every single thing that follows in this story happened in the first place. Start with the ground where it all came down. 2 towers, each rising 110 stories, along with several other structures in the World Trade Center complex, either collapsed entirely or sustained damage that left them beyond saving. A comprehensive analysis commissioned by the New York City Partnership and later reviewed by the U.S. Government Accountability Office put the direct and indirect losses from the physical destruction alone at roughly $83 billion in 2001 terms. Accounting for property damage, the cost of clearing the site, and the economic disruption suffered by every business that had called those buildings home. Of that total, approximately $67 billion was projected to eventually be recovered through insurance payouts, federal relief programs, and the gradual return of normal economic life in the years ahead. The rest, uninsured losses, business interruptions that no policy was written to cover, livelihoods that simply ceased to exist, was absorbed directly by the people and companies who had no other place to send the bill. Few mechanisms in American history have moved money at the scale that insurance did in the wake of that September morning. A Rand Institute for Civil Justice study found that by 2004, the combined compensation flowing to victims, survivors, and affected businesses had reached $38.1 billion from all sources. Total insured losses across the industry were later estimated at roughly $40 billion, placing it among the largest insured events ever recorded. Of that Rand figure, insurance companies alone accounted for approximately $19.6 billion. The biggest single slice of the total. The federal government followed with $15.8 billion, and charitable organizations contributed another $2.7 billion. New York City businesses, concentrated heavily in and around Lower Manhattan, received $23.3 billion of that sum, with 3 out of every 4 of those dollars flowing through insurance claims. The ripple effects permanently altered how terrorism risk is priced and underwritten in commercial insurance markets around the world. No organization bore the human and financial weight of that day more immediately than Cantor Fitzgerald, the bond trading house that occupied the upper floors of the North Tower, directly above where the first plane struck. 658 of its employees did not survive the morning, roughly 2/3 of the company's entire workforce, the steepest single-employer death toll of the day. What unfolded in the weeks that followed became its own kind of case study in what corporate survival actually demands when a catastrophe swallows the majority of your people at once. The firm's leadership chose to reopen within days, bringing in replacement staff at a pace almost no organization has ever been forced to match. At the same time, leadership made a commitment to direct a meaningful share of the company's future profits to the families of the employees who had been killed. A pledge that ultimately put more than $180 million into those families' hands over the years that followed, entirely apart from government fund disbursements or insurance settlements. It stands today as one of the most closely examined episodes in business continuity planning, a real dollar accounting of what it takes, financially and institutionally, to hold a company together after it has lost the core of its own people in a single hour. A separate fund was established with one purpose in mind: to bring some measure of relief to the people whose lives were most violently upended on that day. The original September 11th Victim Compensation Fund ran from 2001 through 2003, distributing roughly $7 billion among 5,560 claimants, reaching 97% of the families of the dead and those who had suffered physical harm in the attacks. But that fund was never designed to close the book on what happened. In the years that followed, tens of thousands of first responders, construction crews, and neighborhood residents who had spent months inhaling the poisonous dust rising off the wreckage began to show up with serious lung diseases and cancers. Congress responded by reopening the Victim Compensation Fund in 2011 to meet precisely that need. By the most recent tallies, the revived fund has distributed more than $16.8 billion to upward of 71,000 claimants, with Congress stretching the filing deadline all the way to 2090. A quiet admission that the human cost of that mourning is still being counted more than 2 decades on in illnesses that did not yet exist when the fund first opened its doors. Putting the physical site back together consumed the better part of 15 years, and the price tag grew with every passing year. An independent audit of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the agency charged with overseeing the reconstruction, found in 2012 that the total cost of rebuilding the World Trade Center complex had ballooned to roughly $14.8 billion, up from an estimated $11 billion just 4 years prior. On World Trade Center alone, the single tower raised to replace the original two carried a price tag of approximately $3.9 billion, making it, upon completion, the most expensive office skyscraper ever built on American soil, with a cost per square foot that dwarfed what a comparable commercial building would run anywhere else in the country. The memorial and museum erected to honor the dead pushed the total higher still, adding close to $1 billion, nearly twice what planners had originally projected. And according to more recent Port Authority financial disclosures, the rebuilt World Trade Center complex had yet to turn a profit more than 7 years after One World Trade Center first opened, its operating costs continuing to outpace whatever rental income the buildings managed to bring in. The industries that absorbed the most direct punishment tell a story worth examining closely. American commercial aviation went dark for 4 consecutive days, a complete nationwide halt of the air transport system that had no historical precedent. Researchers at the University of Southern California would later calculate that when all the downstream consequences were factored in, collapsed passenger demand, the massive overhaul of security infrastructure, and years of subdued booking activity, the attacks had drained more than $200 billion from the U.S. air travel sector and its surrounding ecosystem. Several major carriers had already been walking a financial tightrope heading into 2001. The 1-2 punch of an immediate shutdown, followed by years of anemic travel demand, proved fatal to their balance sheets, and bankruptcy filings followed. Tourism bled just as badly. In the 2 weeks that came right after the attacks, the travel industry recorded losses of approximately $2 billion. Over the following year, more than 335,000 jobs tied to tourism simply vanished. The New York Times put a broader number on the wreckage, around $61 billion in total damage to the travel industry when you looked beyond aviation alone. Stack all of that immediate economic trauma together and you begin to understand why economists are still debating the precise figure. A comprehensive academic survey assembled by economists Adam Rose and S. Brock Blomberg in 2010 found that estimates of the total immediate economic impact stretched from $35 billion at the conservative end all the way to $109 billion at the upper bound, the difference hinging on which direct and indirect costs made it into any given calculation. That lower figure alone, the floor, not the ceiling, exceeded the entire annual economic output of many sovereign nations. The financial markets took a direct blow of their own, and it's worth tracing exactly what happened, because the closure alone was already historic before a single share changed hands. The New York Stock Exchange and Nasdaq went dark for 4 straight trading days, marking the longest shutdown of American financial markets since 1933. When the opening bell finally rang again on September 17th, the Dow Jones Industrial Average shed 684 points, just over 7%, the worst single-day point loss in the index's history to that point. By the time that first week of resumed trading came to a close, the S&P 500 had surrendered nearly 12% of its value, erasing an estimated $1.4 trillion in paper wealth from American markets across 5 sessions. The hardest-hit stocks were those tied to airlines and travel, with Boeing alone shedding close to 18% of its value in a single day. What happened next, though, surprised nearly everyone. The recovery came far sooner than anticipated. Within roughly a month, the S&P 500 had climbed back past its pre-attack levels, a testament to the underlying durability of the broader economy, even as specific industries kept absorbing punishment for years to come. But as staggering as that immediate blow was, it turned out to be the smallest figure in the entire story. What followed rewrote the federal budget for an entire generation. In the wake of the attacks, the United States reorganized vast portions of its government around a single overriding purpose, and that reorganization carried a price tag that made everything mentioned above look modest. By 2011, according to figures compiled by the New York Times, the country had poured roughly $589 billion into expanded homeland security measures alone, a category that had barely registered as a distinct line item in the federal budget before September 2001. That number encompasses a brand new federal department built from the ground up, wholesale overhauls of airport security, rebuilt intelligence infrastructure, and a vast network of new surveillance and screening systems, with approximately $110 billion of it devoted specifically to domestic intelligence spending by that same year. And then come the wars. In the weeks following the attacks, the United States launched military operations in Afghanistan, later pushing into Iraq in 2003 and spreading into a constellation of related campaigns across multiple other nations. Researchers at Brown University's Costs of War project, who have meticulously tracked this expenditure since the fighting began, put the direct budgetary toll of what became known as the War on Terror at roughly $5.9 trillion through 2018 alone, a number that has kept climbing ever since, with more recent tallies from the same team placing the long-term total, once you fold in future obligations for veterans' medical care and disability payments stretching across decades still to come, somewhere around $8 trillion. To give a single year of that spending some sense of proportion, annual war costs crested at around $190 billion in 2008 by itself, more than 4 times what the entire Homeland Security apparatus cost to build over a full decade. A substantial portion of that long-term total isn't military spending in any conventional sense. It's healthcare. Millions of service members rotated through Afghanistan and Iraq over 20 years, and the Department of Veterans Affairs projects that the expense of delivering medical care and disability payments to veterans of those wars will keep rising well beyond 2050. Because many service-connected conditions, from traumatic brain injuries to respiratory diseases tied to burn pit exposure, don't fully surface until years or even decades after the deployment ends. Unlike a construction contract or a legal settlement, this particular category of cost carries no completion date that anyone can honestly forecast. It's worth sitting with that number for a moment, because figures in the trillions have a way of dissolving into abstraction the instant they leave your mouth. $8 trillion exceeds the total combined annual economic output of every nation on the African continent. It is roughly 40 times the entire market capitalization of a company like Nike. Distributed evenly across every man, woman, and child living in the United States, it would amount to more than $24,000 for each of them. There's a category of expense in this account that almost never appears in the financial calculations. And it warrants explicit attention because it illustrates how a single morning's catastrophe sent shockwaves into corners nobody would think to examine. Researchers publishing in Applied Economics documented that, in the months following the attacks, a measurable portion of Americans who would ordinarily have boarded a plane chose instead to drive long distances driven by fear of air travel. Statistically speaking, driving is substantially more dangerous per mile than commercial aviation. That behavioral shift is believed to have contributed to as many as 2,300 additional road fatalities in the year after the attacks. Deaths, the New York Times later calculated, represented an economic toll of roughly $19 billion, applying the same actuarial methods economists use to assign monetary value to human life in safety policy. It stands as one of the more haunting illustrations in this entire account of how a single event can reshape behavior at a national scale in ways that surface months down the line in places bearing no direct connection to the original catastrophe. Let's come back to where this began, because the contrast is really the whole point, and it's better stated plainly than dramatically. 19 men spent, according to the most credible estimates available, somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000, conceiving and executing an attack that claimed nearly 3,000 lives. In the years that followed, the United States spent approximately $589 billion rebuilding its domestic security infrastructure, disbursed more than $60 billion in direct compensation, insurance payouts, and victim assistance to those affected, absorbed somewhere between $35 and $200 billion in immediate economic damage across real estate, aviation, and tourism, and committed itself to military campaigns that current projections place at around $8 trillion in total long-term expenditure. A bill that, through veterans' healthcare and disability payments, is still being settled today and will continue being settled for generations. Measured in dollars alone, the ratio between what it cost to carry out that morning's attack and what it has cost the nation in the decades since runs somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 million to 1. That ratio is no accident, and it has little to do with incompetence or runaway spending. What it reflects is something deeply structural about asymmetric attacks on open, complex societies. A small, low-cost, tightly coordinated strike against critical infrastructure and symbolic targets can set off cascading consequences: security overhauls, insurance repricing, industry restructuring, military deployment that end up costing the targeted nation orders of magnitude more than the attack itself ever did. This happens precisely because a modern economy's greatest strengths, its openness, its interconnectedness, its dependence on aviation and free movement and low-friction commerce, are the very same qualities that make disruption so catastrophically expensive to contain. It's a well-documented pattern in security economics, and September 11th remains its most exhaustively studied case. 23 years later, the financial story of that morning is still being written. The Victim Compensation Fund is still paying out claims today for illnesses tied to toxic dust exposure that are only now being diagnosed in first responders and survivors, and its filing deadline has been extended all the way to 2090. That means people who hadn't yet been born when this video was filmed may one day submit a claim connected to a single morning in September more than a century before. Veterans from the wars that followed are still receiving medical care and disability payments that federal budget analysts expect to keep climbing for decades, long after the military campaigns themselves came to a close. The attack itself lasted just over an hour, from the first hijacking to the moment the second tower fell. The bill, in every meaning of that word, remains open.